At La Charette settlement, clearing in the trees, near today's Marthasville, Missouri, the Lewis and Clark exploring party obtained some milk and eggs from the few persons living there. William Clark occasionally noted other encounters with fur traders passing from the interior country toward St. Louis in canoes and boats loaded with furs. From Clark's notes, June 9, 1804.
Current exceedingly strong struck her bow and turned the boat against some drift and snags, which were below with great force. This is a disagreeable and dangerous situation, particularly as immense large trees are drifting down and we lay immediately in their course. Some of our men, being prepared for all situations, leaped into the water, swam to shore with a rope, and fixed themselves in such situations that the boat was off in a few minutes. I can say with confidence that our party is not inferior to any that was ever on the waters of the Mississippi.
On June 7, three, quote, very large rattlers in, quote, a den of rattlesnakes were put to death, according to Captain Clark. 3 bears were shot, and signs of bison excited the men's imagination. At another time, while sitting on the riverbank, Clark observed a snake trying to attack a freshly killed deer hanging over the river. Presuming, he said, that the reptile was trying to get to the deer's milk sack, Clark was compelled to kill the snake. Apparently, 2 trappers came back from their wintering in Kansas and had lost most of their months-long beaver stow in a prairie fire. Another French trader, Pierre Dorion Sr., who had married and lived among the Yankton Sioux for maybe 20 years, was persuaded to turn around and join the Corps as an interpreter. The grassy bottomlands rose to more bluffs, on top of which one place called Arrow Rock took on historical significance only after the Corps' passing. Lewis and Clark and Company barely noticed the place, as their attention had to focus on large floating logs and sandbar obstacles in the area. Some remnants of abandoned Missouri Indian villages also got a mention. Clark called them the Missouris. Arrow Rock itself, or, quote, Rock of Arrows or Prairies of Arrows in French, became a community in the early 19th century for new settlers and temporarily displaced Osage Indians. A trading post originally established further west at Fort Osage, near today's Kansas City, was moved east to Arrow Rock to service a surge of settlers in the Boone's Lick country and travelers on the newly blazed Santa Fe Trail, roughly 850 miles from Franklin, Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Travelers took a ferry established in 1815 across the river here to refill their water containers in what was then known as the Big Spring. now Little Spring, located behind an old tavern, seeps the precious fluid to this day. As noted in a previous chapter, Dr. John Sappington, who pioneered the use of quinine against malaria, lived in this town. Famed artist George Caleb Bingham also had a home here. His mother is buried in the cemetery. Today, less than 80 persons reside in the town that once counted more than 1,000 souls.
S&H Long of the Yellowstone expedition in 1819 said that it had got its name from the Indians using the outcropping flint to point their own arrows. A blockhouse, which also served as an Indian trading post, was built and operated here from 1813 to 1814 by George Shibley, trading agent for Fort Osage. Also in the area were Cox's Fort, McMahon's Fort, and across the river, Cooper's Fort. In 1821, William Becknell crossed the river here at what became Santa Fe Crossing on the first successful trading expedition to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Laid out as New Philadelphia in 1829 and later renamed Arrow Rock, the town served as the seat of Saline County for 1 year, 1839. During the Civil War, a part of the town was burned.
The Lewis and Clark boats sometimes came to a standstill against the current and wind. The men strained at ropes while tromping through muck and mud near the shoreline from time to time. Clark noted, quote, a bad place, loaded with ticks. Some men had dysentery and or boils and ulcers, in addition to festering mosquito bites. Lewis and Clark eventually concluded that the dirty water was contributing to their troubles, and so instructed the men to dip their cups deeper into the river before drinking in order to avoid some of the surface scum. Clark wrote,
"The water we drink on the common water of the Missouri at this time have a cum wine glass of ooze or mud to every pint."
Grease and campfire smoke detoured some mosquitoes. Military discipline and adventure kept the more than 3 dozen men pressing on. At times the party witnessed, quote, beautiful grass prairies, engulfing islands of trees in places of the bluffs and hills that the Corps passed since St. Louis. Sergeant Gass wrote in his diary, "This is as handsome a place as I have ever seen in an uncultivated state." Clark described the prairies as, quote,
"Unlike those east of the Mississippi, void of anything except grass. They abound with hazel, grapes, and wild plum of a superior quality, called Osage's plum.
One particularly prominent bluff, noted in Clark's journal as an agreeable place, eventually became a key trading post for travelers west. First it was called Fort Clark, but then became Fort Osage. Captain Clark himself participated in its location and construction sometime after the Corps' expedition was finished. During the expedition itself, Clark hunted on foot nearby, and because the boats ended up stranded downriver, he himself became stranded overnight by a campfire, along with another expeditioner who had been sent ahead in search of him. The restored fort site was closed when I arrived one evening in June 2024. However, stepping over a rock barrier, I tramped the grounds for a short time and also wandered into a nearby old cemetery. It was a hot 85 degrees in a silence that did not betray what must have been a much more bustling meeting point above the Missouri for Indians, settlers, and soldiers 2 centuries ago. Nathan Boone operated a saltworks business. In 1808, he served as a militia captain and guide for Captain Eli Clemson and Brigadier General William Clark. Nathan helped build Fort Osage and acted to persuade the Osage to negotiate a peace treaty. In a little more detail provided at the fort's perimeter, on June 23 to 24, the Corps of Volunteers for the Northwestern Discovery spent Saturday afternoon, the night, and early Sunday morning across the river from the Bluffs, which would, in 4 years' time, become the site of Fort Osage. On September 8, 1808, General William Clark, now looking down from those bluffs, wrote in his journal, quote, "This situation I had examined in the year 1804 and was delighted with it. Am equally so now." In March 1807, Clark was appointed as Indian agent for the territory. Clark returned to these Bad Luck Hills, as they were called, in 1808, along with St. Charles Dragoons. They rendezvoused with Captain Eli Clemson and company, George Sibley, and Reuben Lewis, and began construction of the fort. The government Indian trade house was protected by Clemson's troops. During September 1808, with the assistance of Nathan Boone, Clark concluded a treaty with the Osage tribal leaders, persuading them to cede much of their Missouri lands to the government, in what Clark later admitted were shamefully inadequate terms. In November, Captain Clemson dedicated the fort and named it Fort Osage. Sibley became overseer. Much later, Sibley served as one of 3 commissioners on the U.S. government Santa Fe Trail Survey. The fort itself was closed in 1827. Not far upriver, town replacement included Independence, Missouri, and then the town of Kansas, later Kansas City, on the Kansas River. Fort Leavenworth was constructed nearby. The Corps of Discovery on June 26, 1804, approached the mouth of the Kansas River after more than a month of traveling, roughly 400 miles across what is now the state of Missouri from St. Louis. Clark wrote, "The waters, quote, is very disagreeably tasted to me. As a footnote here, I note that the Discovery crew had not yet met Native Americans by the time their encampment on the Kansas River was made. The Osage presumably were making war on some neighbors, maybe Kickapoo or others of the Missouris referred to by Clark earlier. A month earlier, Captain Lewis and Clark had heard from traders on the river that, quote, Kansas Nation are now pursuing the buffalo in the plains. When the expedition arrived at the mouth of the Kansas River on June 26, they saw no Kansa. Clark's maps told him that Kansa villages, or Kaw villages, were located 60 and 120 miles up the Kansas River. These tribes, however, were not necessarily antagonistic to the foreigner intruders at this time. The earlier fur traders and adventurers, apparently mostly Frenchmen, sought to keep things peaceful, both for commercial reasons and desire for self-preservation. On July 2, the expedition camped opposite a long-abandoned Kansa village. During the first half of the 18th century, the Kansa resided at two village sites next to the Missouri River. The village site that Clark observed was the second of those sites, occupied during the 1740s and 1750s. Clark observed that the attractive valley the tribe had occupied was rich and extensive, with a small brook meandering through it. Clark noted the French had formerly had a fort near this location to protect the Kansa and Osage Indian trade. This Fort de Cavagnal was manned from 1744 until 1764, when Louisiana was ceded to Spain and the fort was abandoned. When first encountered by the French, the Kansa were a warlike tribe, but lack of access to firearms gave an advantage to the enemies, the Iowa and the Sauk. According to Clark, quote,
"War with their neighbors must have reduced this nation and compelled them to retire to a situation in the plains better calculated for their defense."
Even earlier in the 18th century, Etienne Vignard de Bourgmont, a former French army officer turned independent fur trader, in 1722 was commissioned to win the allegiance of the Missouri and other local tribes to France. This would prevent Spain from gaining a foothold in the Missouri River Valley. Bourgmont built Fort Orleans on the banks of the Missouri River in today's Carroll County, Missouri. This location allowed him to trade with the Osage, Missouri, and Kansa tribes. Bourgmont also contacted the Plains Comanche and Apache, seeking their alliance with France. He could not keep the tribes from warring with each other, however. Bourgmont was recalled to France in 1726, and Fort Orleans was abandoned 2 years later.